You ever see a person sold like a sack of potatoes? I mean, really seen it? Not in some old-timey picture, but close enough you can smell the dust and the fear. The sun over the town of Aban didn't just shine, it punished. It beat down on the back of your neck like a hot iron, relentless, unforgiving. Dust wasn't just on the ground. It was in the air, in your throat, in the lines around the eyes of folks who'd seen too many years just like this one. And through that heat, through the clatter of wagon wheels and the nervous shifting of horses, one voice cut through it all. The auctioneer. His words cracked like a whip. "Lot 16, he barked, his voice raw as cheap whiskey. One strong-boned girl, 15 summers. Good with her hands, better with a shovel. No trouble, no debt, no kin to speak of." He paused, scanning the crowd of hard-faced men. "We'll start the bidding at $10. Nobody blinked. The crowd was still, a collection of dusty hats and squinting eyes. The girl on the wooden platform? She didn't blink either. Her hands were bound in front of her with a rough piece of rope, but she stood straight. Her dress was faded to the color of the dirt beneath her feet, and she wore boots that looked too heavy for her thin frame. She had a split lip, already scabbing over, and one eye was swollen almost completely shut. But it was the way she held her head, a little tilt to her jaw, a silent challenge that seemed to say, "Go on, try me." And you know what? Nobody wanted to. In the back, one man laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Might make a good scarecrow," he grunted to his friend. Another spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. The crowd wasn't interested. In those days, boys were worth more. Stronger backs, they said, fewer questions. A girl like this? She was a burden, a mouth to feed with no promise of a return. The auctioneer's face soured. This was wasting time. And that's when he saw it. A hand. A single hand raised at the edge of the corral. It belonged to a man in a dusty hat. A man who looked like he was carved from the same hard earth as the rest of this town. That man was Levi Boone. Levi was a rancher who once had dreams as wide as the plains themselves, but life had a way of whittling a man down. His dreams were now narrowed to a few stubborn cattle and a fence line that was always in need of mending. His beard was more dust than hair, and his eyes had that flat, hard look of someone who'd stopped expecting anything good from the world and was rarely disappointed. He hadn't come to town to buy a person. He hadn't come for anything more than nails, a sack of feed, and maybe a bottle to help him forget the 200 acres of regret he called a home. But then he saw her. He saw that defiance in her jaw. He saw the fire smoldering in her one good eye. He saw something that reminded him of, well, he wasn't sure what. But it was something. The man standing next to him nudged him with an elbow. "You drunk already, Boone?" Levi didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the girl. "Reckon I'm about to be," he said, his voice a low rumble. He raised his hand a little higher. $15. A murmur went through the crowd. $15 was real money. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected to get past 10. $15 from Mr. Boone. Do I hear 20? Silence. The man who joked about a scarecrow just shook his head. This was foolishness. Levi didn't wait. He didn't want anyone else getting any bright ideas. "Sold?" he called out, his voice sharp, cutting off any other potential bids. The auctioneer, eager to be done with it, slammed his gavel down on the podium. "Sold to Levi Boone for $15. Just like that, it was done. A life bought and paid for with money meant for nails and whiskey." The girl didn't say a word as Levi untied her hands and led her toward his horse. She didn't thank him. She didn't even look at him. He didn't expect her to. He swung up into the saddle, then reached down and pulled her up behind him. Her frame was all sharp angles and bone, light as a bird. She settled behind him without a sound, her thin arms not quite daring to hold on to him. They rode out of Abene as the sun began to bleed across the horizon. The silence between them was bigger than the sky. It was a heavy, awkward thing, filled with questions neither of them was ready to ask. The wind whispered through the dry grass, the only sound besides the steady plod of the horse's hooves. By the time the first stars pricked the deep indigo sky, they reached the Boone Ranch. It wasn't much to look at. An old homestead that leaned into the hills like a tired old man. a barn that looked one good storm away from giving up, and a few corrals held together with wire and stubbornness. Levi swung down from the horse first, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He turned and helped her down. Her feet touched the ground, and for the first time she looked at the place. Her face gave nothing away. Inside, the ranch house was just as stark, bare-boned but clean. A wood-burning stove, one narrow bed against the far wall, a rough-hewn table, and two chairs. It was the house of a man who lived, but didn't expect to enjoy it. Levi poured a cup of water from a tin jug on the table and handed it to her. She took it without a word, her eyes scanning the small room, taking everything in. She drank about half of it before setting the cup down on the table. The movement made her split lip bleed again, a single drop of dark red against her pale skin. Levi broke the silence. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been all day. She finally looked at him, her one good eye meeting his. It wasn't scared, it wasn't angry. It was just empty. "Don't got one," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Levi frowned. "Everyone's got a name." She just stared at him, a long, unnerving stare that made him feel like he was the one being judged. "I don't," she repeated, and the way she said it, he knew it was the truest thing she'd ever told him. He just nodded slowly. "Fair enough." She walked over to the fireplace, which was cold and dark, and slid down to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. She looked like a small, cornered animal, a coyote caught in a trap, just waiting for the hunter to return. Levi didn't press her with any more questions that night. He didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone you just bought? He tossed a thick wool blanket toward her. "Get some sleep," he grumbled before turning away. He didn't sleep much himself. He sat in one of the chairs, watching the shadows dance on the walls, listening to the sound of her quiet breathing, and wondering what in God's name he had just done. The next morning the wind was howling through the canyon, a lonely, mournful sound. When Levi finally pushed himself out of the chair, stiff and tired, he saw that the girl was already up. He looked through the open doorway and saw her out by the mule pen. She was feeding the stubborn old animal, her movements quick and efficient, like she'd been doing it her whole life. Levi stood there in the doorway, a mug of hot coffee warming his hands, and just watched her for a minute. She moved with a purpose he hadn't seen in himself for years. "You ever worked a ranch before?" he finally asked, his voice rough with sleep. She didn't turn around. "I've worked a lot of things," she said, tossing a handful of oats into the trough. "Cows ain't no different than men. They eat, they stink, and they kick when you least expect it." A dry, rasping sound escaped Levi's throat. It might have been a laugh. He hadn't made a sound like that in a long time. "You got that right," he said, and he left her to it. By midday, she had completely shoveled out the barn, patched a hole in the chicken coop with scrap wood she found behind the shed, and had even rewrapped a busted section of the corral fence with surprising skill. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't ask for instructions. She just saw what needed doing and did it. She worked like someone who didn't know how to do anything else. Like stopping meant disappearing. That night, Levi sat on the porch, his boots off, his feet propped up on the railing. The stars were scattered across the black sky like spilled salt. It was quiet, peaceful. The girl came out and stood beside him, her arms crossed over her chest. They stood in silence for a few minutes, just watching the night. "You gonna tell me why?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. Levi didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "Why what? Why you bought me?" He let out a long, slow breath. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. It was an impulse, a flicker of something he thought had died in him long ago. "You needed a way out," he said simply. "I needed a hand." It was a simple, practical explanation, and it was a lie. Or at least, it wasn't the whole truth. She seemed to consider this for a moment. "You could have left me there," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I could have," he agreed. She didn't say thank you. He was starting to realize she never would. She didn't see it as a rescue. She saw it as a transaction. One cage for another. Maybe she was right. "People are gonna talk," she added, her voice still flat. "Let 'em," he muttered. He'd never cared what people said about him. He cared even less now. She watched him in the dark, her one good eye trying to read the lines etched on his face. He was a puzzle she couldn't figure out. He wasn't like the other men she'd known. He didn't leer at her. He didn't threaten her. He just existed alongside her. "You ever been married?" she asked, the question so sudden it almost made him flinch. He turned his head slowly to look at her. Her silhouette was sharp against the starlight. "Once," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "What happened?" "She died," he said. "Fever took her, and the baby." He hadn't said those words out loud in years. They hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with shared understanding. It was the silence of two people who both knew what it meant to lose everything. The girl shifted her weight from one foot to the other, and then she said something that knocked the breath right out of him. "You could marry me." Levi turned to face her fully, his feet dropping to the porch boards with a thud. He stared at her, trying to see if it was some kind of cruel joke. Her expression was dead serious. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice a low growl. "I know exactly what I'm saying," she shot back, a spark of her earlier defiance returning. "You bought me. In the eyes of the law, that means I belong to you. Least I could do is make sure I belong legal." He shook his head, running a hand through his matted hair. "It ain't right," he muttered. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Ain't nothing about this life right, mister. Ain't nothing about me that ever was." She stared out at the dark, sprawling land. Her shoulders squared, her chin held high. She looked like a queen surveying a broken kingdom. "Give me a name," she said, her voice suddenly soft, almost a whisper. "Give me a name, and I'll marry you before the sun sets tomorrow." Levi pushed himself to his feet. His shadow fell long across the porch, swallowing her small frame. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Why? Why would she want to tie herself to him? To this wreck of a man and this broken-down ranch? "Why me?" he asked, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. She turned to face him, and in the faint starlight, he could see the glint in her good eye. "Because when you looked at me on that platform," she said, her voice steady and clear, "you looked at me like I was a person, not a price tag." He looked at her then. He really looked, past the bruises and the dirt and the ragged dress. He saw the calloused hands that had worked harder than his own. He saw the straightness of her back, a spine that had refused to break no matter how many times it had been bent. And he saw something burning deep inside her, a raw, stubborn grit, a life that refused to be extinguished. "All right," he said, the word coming out before he had a chance to second-guess it. He cleared his throat. "The name's Ruth." She nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement, as if she were trying the name on for size. "Ruth," she repeated softly. "Ruth Boone." She said it again, a little louder this time. "Sounds like it belongs somewhere." Levi didn't smile. He didn't know if he remembered how, but something in his eyes softened, a thawing of a winter that had lasted for years. "Reverend's still in town?" she asked, her voice all business now. "Likely," he answered. "You sure about this, girl? There's no going back." She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm sure I ain't got much to lose." And just like that, the decision was made. They rode back into town the very next day. Ruth wore a clean but oversized shirt he'd loaned her, and his old work boots, which were 2 sizes too big. She looked strange, a collection of borrowed parts, but she held her head high as they rode down the main street. The clerk at the chapel was a small, balding man, with glasses perched on the end of his nose. He didn't ask questions. He'd seen enough strange things in this territory to know that some questions were better left unasked. Levi put his name on the marriage license with a steady hand. Then he handed the pen to Ruth. She signed her new name with a hand that didn't tremble, her letters neat and precise. The vows were short and to the point, mumbled by a tired reverend who just wanted to get back to his lunch. The silence after he pronounced them man and wife was even shorter. On the ride back to the ranch, something shifted. Ruth leaned against him for the first time. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was pure, bone-deep exhaustion, like she'd been holding herself together with sheer willpower, and now that it was done, the strings had finally snapped. Levi didn't say anything. He just sat up a little straighter, trying to be a steady presence for her to lean on. His own heart was beating a strange, heavy rhythm in his chest. They arrived back at the ranch just as dusk was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The coyotes were starting to yip in the distance, their calls echoing through the hills. Ruth slid off the horse and stood there for a moment, looking at the leaning house and the broken fences. But she was looking at it differently now, like she was seeing it for the first time as something that was, in some strange way, hers. "You expect me to be your wife now?" she asked, her voice laced with a new kind of uncertainty. Levi shook his head. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I expect you to be Ruth." She nodded once again, that slow, thoughtful nod of hers. Then she turned and went inside without another word. That night, as the wind curled around the corners of the house and the fire popped softly in the stove, Levi sat at the table, staring at the simple iron ring on his finger. It felt like it belonged to someone else. Across the room, Ruth lay on the narrow cot he'd set up for her, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Neither of them slept much, but the silence between them had changed again. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. There was no love in that little house on the prairie, not yet. But something else was starting to grow. Something quiet and stubborn and tough, like a single determined seed, buried deep in the dry, unforgiving desert, starting to push its way toward the sun. The mornings at the Boone Ranch always came too early, chased by the smell of strong coffee and the groaning of old wood. But Ruth was always up before the sun, moving through the pre-dawn gloom like a phantom. Her hands, already calloused, were becoming rougher, shaped by rope and wood and iron. Her boots were perpetually caked in the mud and dust of the land. She had a way about her, a silent understanding of the rhythm of the place. She never asked what needed doing. She just saw it, and she did it. She fixed the leaky trough in the horse corral before Levi even noticed it was dripping. She mended a saddle strap that snapped mid-ride, her stitches small and neat and stronger than the original. And when the first big storm of the season rolled in, during their second week as man and wife, she was the one who seemed ready for it. She stood in the wide-open barn door, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and just watched the wall of angry gray clouds rumble closer. She looked like she was daring the sky to try its worst. Levi came and stood beside her, a bucket in each hand. "You always this mean to clouds?" he asked, a rare hint of humor in his voice. "I don't trust anything that shows up loud and don't leave nothing but a mess," she replied, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. A small smile tugged at the corner of Levi's mouth. It felt foreign on his face. She didn't notice. That storm was no idle threat. It hit them like a fist. The wind came first, a freight train of fury that ripped through the valley, tearing at the roof and rattling the windows. Then came the rain. Not a gentle spring shower, but an angry, violent downpour that turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud. They spent the entire night fighting to keep the ranch from being washed away. They braced the groaning barn doors with heavy beams of wood. The roof of the house leaked in a dozen different places, and they scrambled to place buckets and pots to catch the steady drip, drip, drip. The old mule screamed once, a terrified sound when a bolt of lightning struck a tree on the ridge. The crack of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the house. Through it all, Levi found himself watching Ruth. He expected her to be scared. He expected tears or at least a flinch. He got neither. She moved through the chaos with a calm, focused energy, her face set in a grim mask of determination. And when the storm finally exhausted itself and the morning sun painted the ravaged hills in a pale, silvery light, she was the first one out the door. She started clearing the debris, dragging fallen branches out of the yard, her movements methodical, as if the storm had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. By the third week, the whispers started. In the dusty aisles of the general store in Abine, folks would stop talking when Levi came in. The whispers would follow him out the door like a cloud of flies. "That Boone boy's finally lost it," they'd say, their voices low. "Married a girl fresh off the auction block. Can you imagine? Heard she ain't got no name, no past. Maybe he's just desperate. Or maybe," one old-timer added, his eyes narrowed, "maybe he's got secrets that ain't none of our business." Levi didn't pay them any mind. He never had. He'd learned a long time ago that other people's opinions were just noise. But Ruth heard. She heard everything. She had a way of standing perfectly still, of seeming to fade into the background, and people would forget she was even there. You know, they think I'm some kind of curse, she said one night. They were in the barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and leather. She was patching one of his old saddlebags, her hands nimble, her stitches clean and even. Levi was sharpening a set of shears on a grinding stone. I've been called worse, Levi muttered, not looking up from his work. Yeah, but a curse is different, she said. It's something you carry with you, something that poisons everything you touch. She glanced up at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her good eye. I've been cursed before, Levi said, his voice flat. Didn't look like you. A tiny smile touched her lips, a rare and fleeting thing. Is that supposed to be a compliment? Might be, he grunted. Their dinners were quiet affairs, usually just bread and beans, maybe a thin stew if Ruth managed to hunt down a rabbit or two. She didn't have a hunter's patience, but she had a dead eye with Levi's old rifle. She had a precision that he found himself admiring more and more. Still, there was this thing that hung in the air between them. It wasn't silence, not anymore. They had grown comfortable with the quiet. It was more like an unfinished question, a story with the middle pages ripped out. Ruth never pressed him about his past, and he never asked about hers. It was an unspoken agreement. But one night, that changed. The moon was a perfect silver dollar in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the land. Ruth was sitting by the fire, her knees pulled up to her chest, just staring into the flames. Levi sat across the room, sharpening a hunting knife on an old whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound in the room. You ever kill a man? She asked, her voice so low it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Levi's hand stopped moving. The scraping sound ceased. The silence that rushed in was sudden and deafening. He looked at her, really looked at her, for a long minute. Is that a question? He said slowly. Or a warning? Maybe both, she replied without taking her eyes off the fire. He considered her for a long time. He'd never spoken of the war to anyone. Not his first wife, not his parents. He'd buried it deep. But something about this strange, broken girl made him want to tell the truth. The war took a lot of things from me, he finally said, his voice a low rasp. Part of that was mercy. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It wasn't a nod of pity, it was a nod of understanding, as if she knew exactly what he meant. Then he turned the question back on her. You? She was silent for a moment. Then she turned her right palm toward the firelight, uncurling her fingers. There was a faint, silvery scar running across her lifeline. I stabbed a man once, she said, her voice completely matter-of-fact. He tried to pull me into a wagon outside of Wichita. I cut him with a piece of broken glass I found in the street. She paused. Don't know if he died. Don't much care. You run after? Levi asked. No, she said, curling her fingers back into a fist. Walked. The fire crackled between them, but it didn't break the sudden heavy weight of what they had just shared. They had shown each other their scars, the ugliest parts of themselves. Levi set the blade and the stone down on the table beside him. You ain't scared of me, he said. It wasn't a question. No, she confirmed. Why not? Because, she said, finally turning to look at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. You ain't ever looked at me like I'm something to take. He nodded slowly. That's 'cause you ain't. And in that moment, the space between them shifted again. It wasn't trust, not yet, and it certainly wasn't love, but it was something with roots, something that was starting to take hold in the hard, rocky soil of their lives. By the end of that first month, Ruth was riding the fence lines with him every day. They didn't talk much on those long rides, but Levi found a strange comfort in her silent presence. She scanned the land with the same watchful eyes he used to have, before time and grief had worn them dull. One morning, while they were repairing a collapsed section of fence near the southern pasture, Ruth crouched down in the dirt and traced a pattern with her finger. You ever think about selling this place? She asked. Levi looked up from the post he was setting, the sun casting sharp lines on his weathered face. Every damn day, he admitted. So why don't you, she asked. He leaned on the half-set post, the weight of the world seeming to settle on his shoulders. Because, he said, his voice barely a whisper, this place is the last thing I didn't quit on. Ruth nodded thoughtfully. She looked around at the dry, unforgiving land, at the leaning house, at the endless sky. Maybe it's worth keeping then, she said. He almost smiled. But trouble, like bad weather, never stays away for long. It came late one evening, in the form of a single rider. He was a big man, with a jaw that looked like it had been broken and set crooked, and hands that were too clean for a rancher. He didn't knock. He just swung off his horse and stood in the middle of the yard like a man who was used to owning every inch of ground he stood on. You Boone? He asked, his voice a low growl. Levi stepped out onto the porch, moving slowly, deliberately. He wiped his hands on his pants. Ruth stayed inside, but he could feel her watching through the window. I am, Levi said. Name's Cutter, the man said. Heard you got yourself a new bride. He looked past Levi toward the house. One with no name, no people, and a real short history. Levi didn't flinch. What's your point? Cutter's lips curled into a sneer. She belonged to my brother. At least he thought she did. Right before she ran off and cut him good. He died from a fever a week later. The wound got infected. He spat on the ground. I came looking for what's ours. Levi's hand moved just slightly to rest on the handle of the axe he'd been using to chop wood. You looking for justice or revenge? Aren't they the same thing? Cutter shot back. Not here, Levi said, his voice dangerously quiet. And that's when Ruth stepped out. She moved with a slow, steady grace, the old shotgun he kept by the door held loosely in her hands. I ain't running this time, she said. Cutter turned and his eyes lit up with a dark, ugly satisfaction. Well, look who got brave. I was always brave, Ruth said, her voice as cold as a river in winter. You just never saw it. Cutter let out a dry, mean laugh. Girl, you think marrying this sack of dirt makes you untouchable? Levi stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. She didn't marry me to hide, he said. She married me because she wanted a name. You're a fool, Boone, Cutter spat. No, Levi said, his eyes locking with the bigger man's. I just got nothing left to fear. The two men stared each other down, the silence stretching taut between them. The air was thick with the promise of violence. Then Cutter leaned back and laughed again, a sound with no humor in it. I won't forget this, he said, turning back to his horse. I'm counting on it, Levi replied. Cutter swung himself into the saddle and rode off, the dust from his horse's hooves trailing behind him like a snake. Ruth watched until he was just a speck on the horizon. You should have let me shoot him, she muttered, her knuckles white on the stock of the shotgun. He wasn't here for a fight today, Levi said, his eyes still scanning the trail. Not yet. He turned to her, his face grim. You scared? No, she said, and he knew she meant it. That night, without a word, Ruth moved her things from the cot to the one bed in the house. She didn't ask. Levi didn't object. They lay down side by side in the dark, their backs to each other, a foot of space between them. But the quiet was full of meaning. After a long time, she reached out her hand under the blanket. He let her find his, and their fingers intertwined. Outside, a lone wolf howled at the moon. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a promise. They were no longer two people surviving side by side. They were one story, and it was far from finished. They came at dawn, not with a lot of shouting or gunfire, but with the heavy, ominous silence of men who were so convinced they had already won that they didn't need to make a fuss. There were 6 of them, dark silhouettes against the rising sun. Cutter was at the front, his hat pulled low, a rifle resting across his lap like it was a natural part of him. Ruth spotted them first. She was in the kitchen, flour still dusting her hands from making bread. She didn't scream or cry out. She just wiped her hands on her apron, walked outside, and picked up the shotgun that was always leaning by the porch post. Levi came out a second later, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He followed her gaze to the riders approaching, and his jaw tightened. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the men. You still sure you're not scared? He asked quietly. Ruth chambered a shell into the shotgun with a loud, definitive clack. I'm sure they should be. He nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. He took the shotgun from her. You're better with this, he said, handing her the six-shooter from his own belt. She didn't argue. She checked the pistol, then holstered it on her hip, her movements fluid and practiced. She crossed her arms over her chest as the riders slowed to a stop, about 20 feet from the porch. Cutter dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. He moved like a man arriving at his own party, calm and ready for whatever came next. Told you I'd be back, Boone, he said, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. And I told you not to, Levi replied, his own voice deceptively mild. Cutter's eyes danced with a cruel amusement. He gestured to Ruth with his chin. You really think one broken-down ranch, one little piece of paper from a preacher, and a half-dead name protects her? She ain't looking for protection, Levi said. She's looking for peace. Then she should have made her peace with God, Cutter snapped, because today I'm burying her. The other riders didn't speak. They were younger, hired guns with twitchy fingers and eyes that kept darting around nervously. They had the look of men who were paid to be tough, but didn't really have the stomach for killing. Not like Cutter. He thrived on it. I brought proof this time, Cutter continued, pulling a folded, stained letter from the inside of his jacket. Legal-like. A contract. Said she was bound to my brother, fair and square. He paid good money for her. You took something that wasn't yours, Boone. Ruth took a step forward. I was never his, she said, her voice ringing with a strength that made even Cutter pause. I was sold. There's a difference. Same thing in these territories, Cutter sneered. Not on this land, Levi said, his voice dropping to a low growl. Cutter held up the letter as if it were a holy relic. You really think some dried-up ex-soldier and a broken girl can tell the law what it is? No, Levi replied, raising the shotgun so it was pointed vaguely in Cutter's direction. But we can tell it where to shove it. The tension drew tight, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. The sun was climbing higher, casting long, menacing shadows across the yard. Cutter's men shifted nervously in their saddles. Ruth's hand never left the grip of her pistol. You really want to do this? Levi asked quietly. Cutter's smile turned into a full-blown, ugly grin. I want my brother's debt paid, in blood or in chains. Makes no difference to me. He nodded to his men. So pick your payment. But he was too slow. The first shot didn't come from Levi. It came from Ruth. Her draw was a blur of motion. The pistol was in her hand, aimed and fired before anyone could even react. It was a fast, clean shot. One of the younger men on the far right let out a choked gasp and tumbled from his horse before his own weapon had even cleared its holster. That single shot broke the spell. The morning erupted into a deafening roar of gunfire. Levi dove to his left, rolling behind the water trough, and came up firing the shotgun. The blast sent two men reeling, their horses screaming and bolting. Ruth moved like lightning. She was a small, fast target, weaving between the porch posts, using the house for cover. Her pistol cracked twice more. 2 shots, 2 hits. Another man slumped over in his saddle. The third man, seeing his friends go down so quickly, lost his nerve. He yanked on his horse's reins and bolted, galloping away into the hills without firing a single shot. Cutter, caught completely by surprise at the ferocity of their defense, ducked behind a fallen barrel, shouting orders. But his men were in a full-blown panic. One dropped his rifle and just ran. Another screamed as a bullet grazed his arm, and he stumbled away, crying for his mother. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was quiet. The only sound was the wind and the ringing in their ears. Smoke curled from the scorched dirt. 3 bodies lay still in the yard. 2 horses were down, their legs kicking feebly. Levi rose slowly from behind the trough, the shotgun empty in his hands. Sweat was running down his temple, carving a clean line through the dirt on his face. Ruth stood across the yard from him, breathing heavily, but her hand was steady, the pistol still aimed. Only Cutter remained. He stepped out from behind the barrel, his face a twisted mask of shock and hate. He held both of his hands up in the air. You don't have the guts, he sneered at Levi. You're a coward, just like everyone said. You're right, Levi said, his voice flat, and then Ruth shot him in the leg. Cutter dropped with a grunt, clutching his thigh as blood poured out between his fingers. He stared at Ruth, his eyes wide with disbelief. I do, Ruth said, her voice cold as ice. Levi walked over and stood over the squirming man. He looked down at Cutter with no pity in his eyes. This is your one and only warning, Levi said. You crawl back to whatever hole you came from. You tell every soul between here and Kansas that the Boone Ranch don't take slaves, don't take threats, and it sure as hell don't take orders. Cutter snarled through the pain. She'll never be free. We'll never stop coming for her. She already is, Levi said simply. They left him there, crawling toward his fallen horse. Ruth didn't look back. She walked back into the house, wiped a smear of blood from her cheek with the back of her sleeve, and went right back to kneading the bread she had started that morning. An hour later, as expected, Sheriff Dobbins rode in. He was a weary old man who had seen too much trouble in his time. He saw the bodies, the blood in the dirt, the lingering smoke in the air, and he didn't ask a single question. He'd heard the gunfire from the East Hill and had figured the Boone place had finally met whatever demons it had been holding back. Instead, he just found Levi sweeping the porch, as calm as you please. You want me to write this up? Levi asked, not stopping his sweeping. The sheriff scratched his thick beard. No one around here, much like the Cutters, he said after a moment, considered 'em vermin. Then we'll call it settled, Levi said. The sheriff nodded once, turned his horse around, and rode off. That evening, Ruth sat on the porch, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, staring out at the hills. Levi came and joined her, sitting in his usual chair. They sat in silence for a long time. I knew someone would come, she finally said, her voice quiet. I just always hoped they wouldn't. He nodded. I didn't shoot him because I was scared, she continued, her gaze distant. I shot him because I remember how it feels to be owned, and I ain't ever going back to that. He didn't respond. She didn't need him to. She looked over at him. I'm not done running, you know. It's the only thing I'm good at. No one's asking you to stop, he said, but I'm tired. He looked at her, and the lines around his eyes seemed to deepen. Then stay tired here, he said. The days that followed passed with a strange, new kind of calm. The land didn't care about the blood that had been spilled in the dirt. The animals still needed feeding. The fences still needed mending. Life, stubborn and persistent, went on. Ruth found a deep comfort in that. One night she walked out to the fields alone. Levi watched her go from the porch. Then after a moment, he followed at a distance, his curiosity getting the better of him. She walked all the way to the small creek that marked the edge of his property. She knelt by the bank, plunging her hands into the cold, clear water. She just stayed there for a long time, her head bowed. He waited. I used to dream about rivers, she said, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. She hadn't looked back, but she knew he was there. When I was in that place, I'd close my eyes and pretend I could hear one. It was the only thing that made me feel clean. Levi walked over and sat on the grassy bank beside her. You're not dreaming anymore, Ruth. She glanced over at him, a small, sad smile on her face. No, but I still don't know what kind of woman I'm allowed to be now. Whatever kind you want, he said. Is it that simple? No, he admitted, but it's true. They sat in silence, listening to the creek whisper around their boots. A coyote howled in the distance. The wind rustled through the tall grass. When they finally returned to the house, Levi lit the lantern and started fixing a loose hinge on the back door. Ruth stood nearby, watching his hands work. You know, she said, we never had a real wedding. He didn't look up from the hinge. You want one? I want something real, she said. He stopped working and met her eyes. The lantern light cast a warm glow on her face. You got it, he said. They married again 3 days later. Not in a dusty chapel, not with a tired preacher. It was just the two of them, standing under the big twisted oak tree near the pasture. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. There was no crowd, no witnesses. Levi said the words he remembered his parents saying to each other. Words about partnership and respect and standing together against the storm. Ruth whispered her own promises, not to him, but to herself. Vows to be strong, to be free, to never be owned again. Afterward, they didn't kiss. They just held hands and stood there for a long time, staring out at the horizon. The land was still dry, the work was still hard, but something fundamental had shifted between them and in them. That night, for the first time, Ruth laid her head on Levi's chest. She listened to the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat, and it felt like the only sound in the world that told the truth. I always thought love was supposed to be something soft, she whispered into the darkness. He was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her hair. It ain't, he finally replied, his voice a low rumble. It's what you carry when nothing else will move. She closed her eyes and smiled. The story they had begun wasn't a fairy tale. It was jagged and messy, stitched together with scars and ghosts and gunfire. But it was theirs, and it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The morning sky burned with the orange fury of a coming storm. Dust whipped through the valley, not the gentle dust of a dry summer day, but an angry, agitated haze, as if the land itself were trying to warn them. Levi stood at the edge of the west field, one hand resting on his belt, his eyes locked on the distant trail that wound down from the north ridge. He hadn't said a word since sunrise. He was just watching, waiting. Ruth knew that look. He was counting. 5, he finally muttered, his voice low and tight. Maybe 6. She came and stood beside him, her hand instinctively going to the worn leather of her gun belt, tightening it. Too many to be just drifters. They're not drifters, he said, his jaw clenching. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were like chips of granite. They're cutters. What's left of them? Ruth nodded, the name sitting like a piece of rusted iron in her mouth. In the months since the standoff, they'd heard the whispers, stories carried on the wind from saloons and trading posts, tales of broken men limping into town, spinning wild stories of blood and rebellion at the Boone place. Most folks had dismissed them as drunken ramblings, but the wrong kind of people had listened. They think you're building an army out here, Levi said. They think you're starting a rebellion. I'm not, she said simply. No, he agreed, but they think you are, and that's enough. The cutters hadn't just vanished. They had scattered like snakes in the grass, nursing their wounds, waiting for the right time to regroup and strike. The man they had left crawling in the dirt hadn't limped away in defeat. He had gone to gather whatever venom was left in his kin, and now they were back. But Ruth knew deep in her bones that this time was different. They weren't coming to reclaim her. They were coming to erase what she represented. Defiance. A woman who refused to stay sold. A man who had not only sheltered her, but had armed her, had taught her how to fight, and then had the audacity to step back and let her aim for herself. They rode hard, a tight formation of 6 shadows cutting through the rising heat haze. At their head was a man they hadn't seen before. He had the cutter look, the same hard eyes, the same cruel set to his mouth. But he was different, colder, more precise. He rode with an unnerving stillness, a man completely in control. This, she knew, was Silas Cutter, the eldest of the brood. She'd heard whispers of him back in Wichita, a name spoken in hushed tones, a bounty hunter who had a reputation for being more of an executioner. No bluster, no empty threats, just cold, efficient death. Ruth swallowed the lump of tension building in her throat. He's different from the other one, she said. He's worse, Levi confirmed, his voice grim. His brother was a bully. This is what happens when killing stops being a tool and becomes the point. Ruth turned and started walking quickly toward the barn. Then we don't wait for them to get here, she said. They worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency that spoke of months of preparation. They had known this day would come. Levi moved through the house, checking the barricades on the windows, loading every rifle and pistol they owned. Ruth moved through the yard, a leather satchel over her shoulder. She scattered shells and loaded cylinders into small, hidden caches. Behind the water trough, under a loose stone in the porch, inside a hollowed-out fence post. It was a trick she'd seen her father do, years ago, before they lost the farm to debt and men with guns. Every action carried a grim purpose. They weren't just defending a home anymore. They were preparing to make a statement. By the time the riders reached the front gate, The storm had arrived in full force. Thunder cracked open the sky directly above them. A flash of lightning lit the landscape for a split second, making the world look like a stark, overexposed photograph. Silas Cutter dismounted without a word, his long black coat flapping around him in the wind like a funeral flag. His men stayed on their horses, their hands on their guns, their faces grim. Ruth stepped out onto the porch first. She wasn't holding a shotgun or a rifle, just the familiar weight of the revolver on her hip and a fire burning in her chest. "You must be Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the rising wind. He didn't smile. His eyes were like two black holes. "You're Ruth." "That's right," she said. He took a few steps closer, his gaze sweeping over her, dismissive. "I'm not here for your husband." "You're not going to get him either," she shot back. Silas's eyes narrowed slightly. "He didn't take you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "He armed you. That's worse." "Then I'm the threat," she said, taking a step forward. "Come for me." He tilted his head, a gesture of cold consideration. "Oh, I will," he said, "but I'd rather break him first. A thing is only as strong as the one who made it." "You're welcome to try," a voice said from the side. It was Levi. He stepped into view from behind the barn, his rifle raised and settled comfortably against his shoulder. The riders flinched, their hands tightening on their weapons. But Silas just raised one hand, a small, calming gesture, and they froze. "No one moves unless I say," he commanded. "You came for a war, Silas?" Levi said. "Let's not pretend otherwise." Silas looked from Ruth to Levi, then back again. A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed his face. "I came for a correction," he said. "You're not supposed to survive, Ruth. You're a lesson. You're supposed to teach others what happens when they rebel." "I am," she said, her lips curling into a defiant smile. "Look around you." Before Silas could reply, it happened. One of his own men, a young kid with twitchy eyes, lost his nerve. He pulled his pistol too soon. It was a fatal mistake. The moment the gun started to clear the holster, Ruth dropped, diving behind a barrel as Levi fired. The rifle's report was deafening, and the twitchy kid was thrown backward off his horse, a neat hole in his chest. Chaos erupted. The storm broke overhead, the rain coming down in a hammering sheet, turning the yard into a quagmire of mud and blood. Bullets tore through the air, whining and thudding into the wood of the house. Ruth moved like a ghost between points of cover, the rain plastering her hair to her face. Her pistol barked, and she fired with a ruthless, deadly precision. Two more riders fell before they even knew where she was shooting from. Levi held the front, laying down a steady, suppressing fire with the rifle. Every shot was a sentence. Every hit was a period. But Silas was different. He advanced through the chaos, slow and methodical, as if the bullets were afraid to hit him. He moved with a chilling purpose, his eyes fixed on the house. Ruth ducked behind the well to reload, her hands moving with frantic speed. She saw Levi retreating toward the porch, limping slightly. He'd been hit, a graze on the thigh. Silas saw it too, and he changed direction, a predator sensing a wounded animal. Ruth fired at him, but the shot went wide in the driving rain. Silas spun and returned fire without even seeming to aim. Wood splintered from the well inches from her face. Then he was past her, in the yard, closing in on the porch. Levi had made it onto the steps, blood running down his leg, but he stood his ground, waiting. Silas didn't rush. He walked up the steps as if he were walking into a church. "You gave her power," he said, his voice calm amidst the storm and the gunfire. "But you're still the root. I cut you down, the rest of it dies." "Wrong," Levi grunted, raising his now empty rifle. "I'm not her roots." Silas lunged. The two men collided like tectonic plates. Levi swung the heavy rifle like a club, but Silas was too fast. He ducked under it and came up with a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand. They grappled on the slick, wet porch boards, a desperate, brutal dance of survival. Levi was bigger, stronger, but he was injured, and Silas moved with the deadly grace of a snake. Ruth screamed his name, but it was lost in a crack of thunder. Silas plunged the blade deep into Levi's shoulder. Levi roared in pain, but he didn't fall. Instead, he drove his head forward, headbutting Silas with all the strength he had left. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the killer stumbled backward, momentarily stunned. And that was the opening Ruth needed. She launched herself onto the porch, landing beside Silas before he could recover. Her pistol cracked once, twice. The first shot took him in the knee, the second in the hand that held the knife. The weapon clattered to the boards. Silas collapsed with a groan, reaching for his shattered knee with his one good hand. Ruth stood over him, her eyes dark, the rain dripping from her hair like a crown of storms. "You think killing a man makes you powerful?" she said, her voice shaking with rage and adrenaline. Silas looked up at her and grinned, blood running from his broken nose and mouth. "I didn't come for power," he rasped. "Then what did you come for?" she demanded. "Justice," he sneered. The final shot echoed across the valley, louder than the thunder. Silas Cutter died with a sneer on his lips and a look of genuine surprise in his eyes. Ruth dropped to her knees beside Levi. He was pale, his teeth clenched against the pain, but he was conscious. "Still here," he muttered through gritted teeth. "You better be," she said, helping him to his feet. They stumbled inside together, leaving the storm to wash away the blood. Each step was a defiance, each breath was a victory. Later, much later, when the bodies were buried and the tools were put away, Ruth sat beside Levi on the porch again. The storm had passed. The air was clean and cool. He was stitched up and silent, his hand resting lightly on hers. "You killed a legend today," he finally said, his voice quiet. "No," she answered, looking out at the horizon. "I buried a nightmare." "What happens now?" he asked. She looked out at the land. The clouds were breaking apart, and shafts of sunlight were clawing their way through, a promise of a clear day tomorrow. "We build," she said. "From what?" he asked. She squeezed his hand and looked at him, her eyes clear and full of a fierce, unyielding strength he'd never seen before. "From us." There were no cheers. There were no parades. There was just quiet survival, stitched together with blood and rain, and something fierce enough to last. And far away in towns that had once bought and sold human lives, people began to whisper a new legend. Not of the Cutters, but of a woman with eyes like steel and a man who stood with her, no matter the storm. The Boone place stayed quiet after that, but the silence wasn't fear anymore. It was respect. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of justice from the forgotten corners of the world, do me a favor. Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. You never know what story we'll uncover next.